and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. To say that the European debate over the war in Ukraine, at least in the elite halls of government, academia, and the professional classes, is virtually non-existent might be an understatement. For all of the grousing by my friends in the realism and restraint world about the hive-mind thinking about Russia and the war since 2022, it is nothing like the conformist strictures that exist in the European capitals of Brussels, UK, France, Sweden, Germany, and elsewhere, and the so-called transatlantic community. In recent months, as Trump has staked out a new direction for the U.S. policy on the war toward a negotiated settlement and away from endlessly arming a war of attrition, the Europeans have seemingly dug further in. First, they were gobsmacked when they were not invited to initial talks with Russian leadership in the first days of the administration. Then they were taken back by the Trump team's insistence that Europe had to take more responsibility for its defense. Leaders like Emmanuel, Macron of France and Keir Starmer of the UK used this as an opening to push for more military assistance and support for Ukraine, even proposing a peacekeeping force of European soldiers, as well as suggesting boots on the ground if Russians became more aggressive. This especially has been dismissed widely, as even supporters acknowledge much could not be done without the backing of the US military. At the root of it all is that the majority of European leadership, particularly in the EU, has not moved very far, if at all, from their initial position that Vladimir Putin and the Russians pose an existential threat to Europe. That is much different than the Trump position that Russia needs to be brought in from isolation in order to end the war and plan for a new security reality in Europe that does not involve NATO closing in on Russia and leaving the region on a perpetual war footing. Here to talk with me about this and more are two prolific writers on European security, diplomacy, and politics who have rare alternative takes on current affairs relating to the Ukraine war, NATO, and the elite foreign policy establishment in Europe. Please welcome Ian Proud, who was a member of His Britannic Majesty's Diplomatic Service from 1999 to 2023. He served as the economic counselor at the British Embassy in Moscow from July 2014 to February 2019, and recently published his memoir, A Misfit in Moscow, How British Diplomacy in Russia Failed from 2014 to 2019. And he posts at his Substack, The Peacemonger. Also, Eldar Mammadov has worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Latvia and as a diplomat in Latvian embassies in Washington, D.C. and Madrid. From 2009 to 2022, Mammadov has served as a political advisor for the Social Democrats in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament and was in charge of EP delegations for interparliamentary relations with Iran, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. I am just so happy to have you guys both on the show today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invite, Kel, and nice to meet Eldar for the first time as well.
Yeah. Oh, and I did not mention as well that both of you have written extensively for Responsible Statecraft. I consider you a regular columnist at this point and really add tremendous value to our coverage, particularly on these issues of European security and diplomacy. So first, I'm going to ask Eldar. In December, you wrote that the dominant voices advocating for Ukraine's victory and Russia's defeat, both defined in maximalist and increasingly unattainable terms, are intent on snuffing out more thoughtful and nuanced perspectives, thus to provide, and these are all your words here, thus depriving the public of a democratic debate on the existential questions of war and peace. In a familiar pattern throughout the West, respected academics who correctly predicted the quagmire in Ukraine and the West now find themselves smeared and delegitimized as Kremlin mouthpieces, subjected to harassment, marginalization, and ostracism. And the situation is particularly alarming in Europe, you mentioned. So to your mind, how has that prepared European elites for the dramatic shift by the Trump administration in regards to its outreach to Putin and insistence in getting to the table? In other words, how are they dealing with the realities post Biden administration in 2025?
Well, Kelly, the main problem that I see with the European elites is that they've shown themselves utterly unprepared for the second coming of the Trump administration, although already some signs of alarm, so to say, were obvious during the Trump 1 administration, but then it was treated mostly as an aberration. And frankly, when Joe Biden was elected in 2020, it seemed like it's going back to normal transatlantic relationship. And now with Trump too, when obviously Trump feels much less constrained in pursuing the foreign policy that he wants to pursue, the European elites are at loss and frankly panicking. All this symmetry of which the French President Macron, you mentioned him, is so fond of producing loads of statements reaffirming strong support for Ukraine, support Ukraine for as long as it takes. But curiously, these proclamations, they're not backed by credible power and credible force to implement them. And when European leaders, while scrambling for a common position, when they discover that they can't do much without the United States, they simply panicking. And there is no clear strategy, there is no clear path to for Europe to assert its own role. And this lack of clarity is compensated by overly flourished rhetoric about values, about democracy, fighting against autocracy, about not allowing Russia to win in Ukraine. But frankly, even more and more people in Europe, in European public, on the margins so far on political spectrum, on the right and on the left, they slowly come to realization that all this talk is just talk, and that the European leaders, frankly, they're delusional when they're talking about things like sending peacekeepers to Ukraine after the peace agreement is reached. Like, what peacekeepers? On what basis? Russians have clearly said that they will not accept that, and whether you like it or not, that's the reality. Which means that those peacekeepers will be treated as combatants, and without the support from the United States, even those who propose those steps, they realize that they're not going to go very far. So I would say the overall mood is one of panic, and it also fosters the divide within the Europe and the growing gap between the European elites and the European publics.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, Ian. You've written quite a bit about the funding issue. You've written that the war goes on, Ukraine will likely be broke by 2026 if the U.S. and Europeans don't create or just maintain levels of funding for both. Yet the Europeans insist that they will continue to fund Zelensky's government as long as it takes, including 15 billion in new pledges in the last few days from Germany, France, and Sweden, combined loans and massive rearmament plan in the order of, like, I think 800 billion or million euros.
Billion.
Yeah. Tell us, is this sustainable? How are people, like actual taxpayers in European countries, feeling about all of these declarations of funding and sustainment, given the economic uncertainty that has persisted since COVID and the impact of Russian sanctions on energy? Are these European leaders just delusional?
Well, short answer, Kelly, yes, they are delusional. And this funding, like this 800 billion plan proposed by the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, it's not clear how it's going to be funded. That funding is artificial to a great extent, in the sense that up to 650 billion of that package is supposed to be funded through the cancellation of debt breaks for military spending in European countries. But what does that mean on the level of the public? For years, we've been told, particularly in Germany, that the debt, it's written in their constitution, that the fiscal discipline is like sacrosanct principle, and therefore we can't fund healthcare, we can't build new schools, we can't upgrade our infrastructure, make sure that trains come on time. You know, all of these are very real problems in Germany. So, and now suddenly the people are told that no, the debt is not a problem, that actually we can cancel that debt break as soon as it comes about military spending.
Yeah.
So,
can I jump in there, Eldar, if you don't mind? I mean, I looked at the numbers in detail, and actually, specifically, you're absolutely right in what you say about the debt break, but specifically the 650 billion additional euros within the 800 requires every member state to increase their defense spending by 1.5% of GDP on top of what they are already spending. So in Germany, where it only has about 69% GDP of debt, that's, letting go of the debt break is less of a problem. In Italy, where debt is 136% of GDP, in France, where it's about 110% of GDP, it's a much bigger problem. The idea that France is suddenly going to unleash another 47 billion dollars a year in defense spending is just completely ridiculous. So nobody's kind of really focusing on this. It's just a soundbite. But to your question, Kelly, I mean, the war has been funded on credit from the very beginning. Every single year, Ukraine has racked up massive debt, the equivalent of 100% of GDP debt since the war, has started. Increasingly, as you say, all of the new money is coming in the form of loans, not kind of free gifts. There just isn't enough money to go around. And, for Europe itself, it has to do kind of three things. It has to deal with massively inflated energy prices. It has to increase its defense spending by 1.5% of GDP for every country. It has to pay for an ongoing war in Ukraine. And then there's a fourth thing, deal with the economic headwinds of global kind of tariff wars. The numbers didn't add up before this tariff war started. They will never add up. And actually, all that means is that Ukraine increasingly is becoming a failed state. And, the sooner we bring this fighting to an end, frankly, the better, because no one can afford it, not at least the Ukrainians.
And I would add to this. What is missing in this whole debate in Europe is what for? What is this all militarization and military spending? What is it for? What is the threat? We are putting the carriage before the horses. So now is this sudden rush to increase military spending at the expense even of fiscal disaster. But there hasn't been a proper democratic debate about what is the nature of the threats. Why do we need all that? And you already see countries like Spain and Italy. They are recoiling at that, and obviously they don't feel the same threat from Russia as people in the Baltic states may feel. How real it is, that's a different discussion. But that's the reality. And politically, it's going to be extremely difficult to sell this sort of militarization drive when, frankly, there is no fiscal space for that. And there are so many other problems which have to be dealt with in Europe.
Well, that was the second part of my question. And Ian, what is the sense? I've seen plenty of tweets out there, posts, and commentary about the people in Britain and how they have recoiled against this idea of spending more on defense when they have economic issues at home that they would like their government to be dealing with. What is the mood there from the people? And then maybe Eldar, after that, you can give a sense of what the people are saying in other parts of Europe. Like, are they in agreement that all of this money should be pledged either for weapons or direct aid to Ukraine?
So I think for British people, they don't link the two issues. They don't link the increase in war spending with actually the war in Ukraine, because propaganda is so extensive here in the UK that it's very difficult to get any counter narrative about actually what is this the right thing to do, to touch on Eldar's point.
So what messages are they getting?
Well, at the moment, they are kind of they are showing some mild hesitation about the kind of what is frankly a very marginal increase in defence spending for the UK from 2.3% to 2.5% of GDP. They don't really. I wouldn't say in any way it's a kind of a widespread movement. Frankly, and it certainly isn't connected in any way to the war that's happening in Ukraine. The government focuses more on sort of domestic issues, talks about the kind of fiscal hole related to the previous government's policies, but they've almost put a firewall between that and actually kind of the war policy in Ukraine. So, and I think part of the problem is actually, politically, not just for Keir Starmer, but also for European leaders, that these European governments have been on this track for 11 years now, and what they effectively have to do is to do a 180, on policy at the behest of Trump, who is universally disliked. So, and nobody wants to do that, even though it very obviously makes sense, to do that. And that's the position we're in now. So people wondering whether and how they can pivot, on the basis of demands from a president of the US that is universally loathed. I'm not saying I have those feelings towards him, but very clearly the political leaders in Europe, generally speaking, do.
So what you're saying is that the British people, maybe I'm getting a skewed version of it on Twitter because of the people I follow, but more or less they don't see a relation between like their domestic fiscal issues and declarations by Keir Starmer and others that they need to be spending more money on defense. And furthermore, they don't see that as a connection to Ukraine, or it's not spurring a debate about whether or not the UK should still be funding a war in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, they absolutely don't. And one of the fascinating things is that a left-wing government has basically jumped on the back of a right-wing agenda, this idea of overseas aid cuts, and actually cut overseas aid to sponsor kind of increased defence spending, basically to pacify, the right, in the UK. So they've almost tried to legitimise defence increases by cutting overseas aid while still keeping this firewall in place with the Ukraine. It's quite a bizarre situation.
It really is.
We find ourselves in.
So Eldar, but in other parts of Europe, you're actually seeing some of the politics being affected. I mean, you see the National Rally Party in France, you see the AfD in Germany, but also far right, our far left parties like the Sarah Wagenknecht party or alliance rather in Germany, actually being fueled by what it seems to be a resistance to continued war spending for Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on in the rest of Europe among the citizenry?
Well, that's correct. And the surveys, like, for example, from European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a reliable think tank, they consistently show that the majority of Europeans across the board, they favor a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine. They are broadly sympathetic with Ukraine. They are in favor of continuing support, like humanitarian support. They admire the bravery of Ukrainians fighting for their nation. But at the same time, the realism creeps in. And it's becoming increasingly obvious that Ukraine is simply in no position to win this war. And more people realize that. And hence, what is next best scenario is that the war stops. Ukraine will lose, if not de jure, then de facto, those four oblasts and Crimea. But the war stops there, and that still leaves Ukraine with like 80% of its territory. And then the reconstruction and rebuilding of the country kicks in. And Ukraine is ensured to be a neutral state, like forever, no NATO membership for Ukraine. So, frankly, that doesn't seem like too bad a deal because if we remember from recent history, countries like Finland, Sweden, Austria, still today, they're all neutral countries and they're all prosperous democracies. So, this whole concept that neutrality is some sort of heresy of some sort of horrible thing, it simply doesn't resonate with increasingly large swaths of European populations. Now, of course, it also depends geographically. I already mentioned Spain and Italy, and frankly, they are not at all on the same line with the Baltics or the Nordics, because their security challenges are completely different. They are not going to fight Russia. They do not fear Russia to the same extent.
Right.
So, but also the problem is that the European elites, especially those in what I call the Brussels bubble, the European Commission, European Parliament, External Action Service, they seem to be living in a completely different reality. And they're so heavily invested in this concept of defeating Russia. Like High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaja Kallas, she's singularly focused, I would even say obsessed, with defeating Russia. And they have been promoting that discourse right from the beginning, from 2022. And they simply seem to be unable to acknowledge that they have been wrong, that frankly, they have lost this war, because for them, that's a question of credibility, the question of status, of prestige.
Right.
And they simply are not willing to listen to their own citizenry and to come to terms with the situation. Hence, when Trump comes in and says fairly sacrilegious things from a European point of view, they're just panicking and they're scrambling for response, but they're not being very successful, frankly.
Ian, the whole idea of the coalition of willing that was brought forward mostly by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, it does seem like they really want to be seen as like tough guys. And I'm not saying that just to dunk on them, because there are plenty of people and leaders in the United States who also want to project that image. And I don't blame them. They're likely tired of being portrayed as, holding America's beer, for example, or just kind of towing along behind. But what happens when they have these big ideas of bringing together a coalition of the willing? They talk about tens of thousands of troops, brought in from the various European states, and then immediately have to sort of dial back these ideas because, as Eldar had pointed out, not all of these countries are fully on board with putting troops on the ground, or don't see Russia as the same exact threat. So can you talk a little bit about the risks that Macron and Starmer are taking politically by going so far out there without being able to back it up?
So I think there are two aspects to this. There's a really actually legitimate and valuable discussion around this, and then there's something that's clearly unworkable. The one that gets the most attention is the unworkable bit, the idea that European countries can deploy some sort of peacekeeping force, even though Russia has said quite clearly that it doesn't want any sort of NATO-led peacekeeping force. Russia is never going to agree to that. And in any case, the UK would struggle to muster 10,000 deployable troops. How many are France going to put in? There are allegedly around 600,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. What are they going to do? So, the whole idea is unworkable. We don't have the density of forces to effect in a meaningful way any sort of peacekeeping operations, in Ukraine. But actually, there is a meaningful part of this debate, which I think actually President Trump's team welcomes, which is the issue around security assurances. If a peace deal is secured, are European countries going to step up and offer sort of security assurances to Ukraine on the basis that American troops won't come in should there be any further sort of Russian incursion in the future? Personally, I think if a peace deal happened and the Russia, that took NATO off the table, Russia would need that, but clearly Ukraine needs some sort of longer term assurances. So there's that debate about the coalition of the willing being countries that are ready to offer a backstop to Ukraine, should Russia sort of threaten them in the future. And I think that is a good conversation to be had. That is very much consistent with what the White House kind of wants Europe to do, to kind of step up and provide leadership in terms of longer term security assurances for Ukraine. It's that discussion, I think, that we should bring sort of more to the fore, rather than getting distracted by this, frankly, totally unworkable sort of peacekeeping idea.
Yeah. I know we only have like a minute or two left, but I wanted to ask both of you a final question. I know that the Europeans were very upset that they hadn't been brought in on those initial talks between the US and Russia right after the inauguration of Donald Trump. And then there's been obviously a lot of acrimony over the coalition of the willing. There's anticipation that the United States might draw back from NATO. There's just been a lot of back and forth. Can you talk a little bit about the importance, at the end of the day, the importance of a European contribution to the negotiated settlement? All jokes aside, Europe has to be part of these discussions. Can you talk a little bit about why and what kind of role that they might conceivably play when things get going? Eldar, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. Well, I think obviously European Union and UK have to be brought into the conversation because it's much larger than just finishing the war in Ukraine. It's about rebuilding the European security architecture and correcting the mistakes that were committed in the early 90s at the proud unipolar moment of US primacy, when it was felt that Russia's concerns are not to be taken seriously. Well, now we have this pushback from Moscow, and it's clearly a conversation that needs to be had. The building of European security architecture, which takes into account and respects legitimate security interests of all players, obviously Ukraine also, but also Russia. And I think what European elites have to do at this point is not to try to play spoilers, stubbornly insisting on the same failed strategies, but try to reassess the big picture, understand where Trump is going. And I think Trump clearly wants not just to end the war in Ukraine, but overall to improve relations with Russia. And rather than playing spoilers, Europeans just need to step into this trend and begin perhaps with small steps like some, sanctions relief, like letting the SWIFT system to process, some financial transactions with Russia to make that grain deal to work, which I wrote a piece about. So, and yet we see that Europeans are just stubbornly, dogmatically wedded to this sanction policy. And frankly, that SWIFT thing, that's not such a big deal. And starting there at least would show some inclination to at least start going in the diplomatic direction. And I think eventually the reality will come in. But for now, what we see is just this very hardline stance. And again, I explain it with questions of pride and prestige, because these European elites, they are so wedded into their confrontational policies. They just simply cannot acknowledge that they've been wrong, and now is the time to change the course.
Ian, as a former diplomat, how do you feel about all of this?
Well, diplomacy is about dialogue, and it's been an explicit sort of European policy to try and limit any dialogue with Vladimir Putin for a very long time, certainly since the beginning of the war. And President Trump did something revolutionary. He actually spoke to President Putin, and the only way to kind of bring an end to any conflict is to talk to both sides. Obviously, to talk to the Ukrainian side, we talk to them all the time. It seems there's barely a day when we don't talk to Ukraine. But also talk to the Russian side. You need to talk to both sides to bring an end, because this is a war between two countries, Russia and Ukraine. And if we're not talking to Russia, then we're not really doing anything to kind of bring an end to the war, which is self-defeating. The extent to which Europe has been excluded from those talks, Europe has excluded itself from those talks. Trump hasn't excluded anybody. He's just spoken to Putin, which is long overdue. Quite frankly, and in my view, extremely helpful in breaking the deadlock. Now it's time for European leaders to actually start to engage as well, not to legitimize Putin's actions before, because no one can legitimize a war which has cost over 1 million people killed or injured over the past 3 years, but to bring peace. Diplomacy is about dialogue. Europeans need to get back to the table. People are now talking that maybe Macron can be the person who's the point person for European. Why does there have to be one European leader who's the one person who talks to Putin? Why can't all leaders talk to Putin in the interest of peace? Keir Starmer said that he still has, even today, no plans to talk to Vladimir Putin. And that tells you all you need to know about UK policy towards Ukraine.
That's right. Well, thank you both. I mean, this was a truly informative and insightful episode, and I know that listeners and viewers are going to get a lot out of it, because what you're saying, as we've talked about, is not broadly reflected in the discourse in Europe and even in the United States. So I really appreciate that you came on to talk so frankly about these issues. And again, both of you write very prolifically for Responsible Statecraft, and Ian, you have your Substack at the Peacemonger. So I hope everybody checks out their work, and we'll have links to your pieces in the show notes as well. And I hope you return on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Great to see you.
Thank you so much, Kelly and I really appreciate it.